Hello, and thank you for joining me once again on the Finish More Music podcast. So, got an epic episode for you today. We got an interview with one of my all-time favorite dance music producers. He has been making tunes and cranking them out now for 30 plus years. Very, very famous and well known with his collaborator, John Digweed, but has got an bunch of solo tracks and solo DJ appearances all over the world under his belt as well. And in my personal opinion, his tracks are as good as you're ever going to hear on the dance floor. So it is an absolute pleasure to welcome Mr. Nick Muir to the show. Nick, how are you, buddy?
I'm fine. How are you, Keith? Thank you for having me, mate.
Yeah, no, I'm, as I said, over the moon to have you on, particularly, hot off the back of your appearance in our online workshop for my FMM Plus high level coaching program, guys, where you were feeding back, and we're just talking to you about the impact that you had in there was absolutely off the charts. They were buzzing, of course, when you opened up the project for the remix of Corsa, which you was telling me it's out this Friday, right? It's out on the 22nd.
Yes,
yeah,
that's right.
So that's when this show goes out, guys and girls. That is going to be ready for you. Incredible remix, destroying dance floors everywhere, or it was anyway when John was playing it out. But they were amazed at that, but they were also totally lit up by your passion and enthusiasm for the scene and music. So I want to really deep dive into all of that. But before we get to that good stuff, I'd love to just sort of explore a little bit of your background, because I know you were a keyboard player before you came into the world of dance music. But I'd love to start right at the beginning, sort of the start of your musical journey.
Sure.
How did it all kick off, and then what got you sort of the bug? What caught you with dance music and has managed to keep your attention for 30 odd years?
Well, where do I start? I'll go back to the beginning, shall I?
Go for it. Yes, rewind us all the way back. It's awesome.
I've been brought up with music, Keith. My mum was a singer. Not professional singer, but she was very serious about her singing. And my two elder brothers were, she tried them on the old piano lessons and didn't get very far. But I was interested in it. We had a piano at home. And when I was like 3 or 4, I used to go out and pick out chords and, try and figure out what I was doing. So she could see that I was somewhat drawn to it. So I had piano lessons from age 5, basically. And I did that whole thing, the classical thing, went to college, and was involved in playing in bands when I was in my teens. And, so also the other thing is my brothers were both, teenagers as I was a little small boy. And they used to, like most teenagers, they were interested in the pop music at the time. And so they would bring it all back. So as well as having the classical thing shoved down my throat, I got the, the Beatles, the Four Tops, all the soul, Jimi Hendrix. I remember my brother coming home with the Jimi Hendrix record, and I'm thinking, what is this? This picture of this guy on the front, and like to a sort of 8 or 9-year-old, it was, I just thought there's something going on here. I don't know what it is, but I like it. So from those early days, I was steeped in, pop music and what was going on and what was the new thing. And so I guess I was lucky in that respect that I was just right in the middle of all this incoming information about the music of the time, plus the classical stuff from my mum. Anyway, so that got me off and running and interested in music at a very small. I mean, my brother had a band, right, when I was maybe 4 and he was 16, and they used to rehearse in our front room. And for me, this was like some kind of magical, the bass guitar. I didn't know what it was, but it had this long neck with these strings on, and the drums with the sparkly finish. And I was sitting there just gobsmacked by the whole thing. So instantly sort of drawn to it. So I got off to a flyer, really, and then did college because, really studying music at college for me was not too much of a, it was a kind of easy choice to make. because I had already been started off, and so I was able to do that. Then I left college, and then that was the end of my studies, and I was sort of, I can remember finishing the degree and sitting there thinking, well, what happens now? I don't know. A lot of people have this experience. I think you go through whatever it is, 15, 16, 17 years of schooling, and you come out, and I was kind of, done that now. So, and I really, really didn't know what I was going to do. So finished in, September, and then I thought, right, well, what do I fancy doing? So I thought, like a lot of people, I'll move up to London. We lived in Hereford at the time, which is West Country, and the bright lights were beckoning Keith. So I thought, I need something to do. So I managed to find myself a job with a music publisher, actually, Universal, just an office job, for the want of not knowing what else to do. So did that for 6 months and moved up to town, rented a flat with a mate of mine, and then that came to an end. And I remember what I did then was I applied to do the assistant studio manager's course at the BBC at the time, which was a really good thing. They didn't take me in the end. I had an interview 1-to-1, and then they give you what they call a board, which was in front of 5 people. And that was like a grilling about technical knowledge, which I just didn't have. I mean, if somebody had told me what to do, then what this consisted of and what they were going to ask me, then I might have stood a better chance. I always remember one question. I'm going off on a tangent, but one question they asked me in that board was, could you tell us what azimuth is in relation to a tape recorder? And I'm like, I have no idea what you're talking about. I'm sorry, I just don't know the answer to that question. Azimuth is the alignment of a tape head on a tape recorder. And I think if I'd known the answer to that question, I would have been in, and my life would have taken a completely different turn. But I always remembered it. I always remembered the answer to that question. And I've been sort of kicking myself. Well, not kicking myself, because I've had a very interesting musical career since then. Anyway, point being, when I didn't get through that board and I didn't get the ASM course at the Beeb, then I thought, well, I'm going to try my hand at playing, see if I can pick up any jobs, because I'm, competent keyboard player. I'd had lessons and I'd played in bands. And there's not, there weren't that many people who were playing keyboard at that age. Piano and organ is what I used to specialize in. And there weren't that many people around who were, of a standard where you could go and audition. So I started doing auditions, and that's how I started in my quest to make a living as a musician. And I've been staggering on ever since.
So you played with a bunch of different bands, didn't you? One that stood out at me was Take That. Is that were they in the list?
That was much later, right? So I started in the early 80s. There was a punk band called Stiff Little Fingers, Irish guys, and they were big news at the time. And Jake Burns, who was the lead singer, he split Stiff Little Fingers and started his own band with the intention of being an Elvis Costello type character. And that was my first audition for like a pro touring band. And so that was in the early 80s. So that got me started. Then I went on to play with Johnny Halliday. I mean, that was just such a trip. He was, literally, he was a French rock and roll star. I mean, the music is what it is. It's French rock and roll. I mean, it's not ever going to be anything that people in this country would be particularly interested in, and kind of cheesy and all the rest of it. But he was a massive star. And so I found myself on stage at age 24, this huge place, size of, it was kind of Albert Hall, not Albert Hall, like Wembley Arena. And wow. We did 6 nights a week in this place, which held around about 7,000. We did 6 nights a week for 3 months. So that gives you some kind of idea of how big he was. And, you know, I just thought, well, this is what life is then. You know, you get jobs and you stand on massive stages and, you know, and you have a laugh and get paid for it, you know.
Not too shabby.
No, that was an amazing experience, and brilliant, because I lived in France for a while and, you know, got an appreciation of all things French and learned to speak the language somewhat. I mean, I should be much better French speaker than I am, considering what I've done there. But anyway, so I played with him for a while, then came back and started trying to put recordings together. We didn't have any sequencers. No, there were no, it was like really early days of, what was the Steinberg sequencer, the first one that they brought out for the Atari 24. You know, Sound Tools was just starting before Pro Tools was ever thought of. But still, we were recording mostly to tape. And I started trying to get my head around sequencers and the idea of triggering sequencers from tape. You know, what you used to do was stripe a tape with a code, SMPTE code. Do you remember all this? Or this?
No, I learned about it when I was doing my music production and sound engineering qualification in London. So I learned all about it. I did a lot of my qualification in Psalm East Studios. Okay. I don't know if you know that one. So yeah,
no, we did some work there actually. There's a story there which I'll tell you later. But yeah, so that was the days when people were running expensive recording facilities which cost, you know, 1,500 quid a day, and if you wanted to sequence, then you would stripe analog tape with a SMPTE code, and then the sequencer was able to read that code and you'd keep everything in time that way. So it was that sort of time that I'm talking about, mid-80s, when I came back from holiday, and I did it like about a year trying to figure out that stuff, as well as doing sessions. Then I went back to France, played with a lesser known singer, and we toured around French Canada. He had a huge hit there. Came back from there, joined a band called Fire Next Time, who was signed to Polydor. And that was one of those things, you know, they had a big deal. Jim, the singer, was supposed to be the next British Bruce Springsteen. That was his thing. We made an album in Rockfield Road. You know that place, Monmouth?
No, I don't know that one.
Rockfield is like a, you know, Queen did Bohemian Rhapsody there, and it's just one of those iconic studios. So we made an album there with Fire Next Time, did a tour supporting a band called The Men They Couldn't Hang, and they were kind of a little bit further up the scale than I was with Fire Next Time. So I said, I'll join your band if you want, and they said, all right then. And so I joined them, made 2 albums with them, and toured around the world. Great bands, loved being with those guys. They're really funny, you know. The music was kind of like the Pogues, that kind of thing, folky, punky kind of thing, which, you know, I could live with. I was all right with that, and we were having fun, and we were getting paid to tour around the world, so I stuck with that for a while. But none of those jobs, Keith, were the type of music that I was particularly drawn to. I always liked the rhythm side of things, you know, something with a bit of funk in it. But for some reason, when I was playing as a session pro, I mean, this is UK as well, you know, that kind of funk scene, you know, you had Level 42 and Shack Attack, but that's not what the music business in this country was running on at the time. It was more like song-based rock. And if you wanted to try and pick up paid work, then that's, you know, for somebody who played piano and organ, there were opportunities there. So that's what I did. But while I was with the Men They Couldn't Hang in the late 80s, that's when Acid House started up. I mean, we were, you know, we were like sort of punky kind of guys. You remember the Travelers, and you know, all those people who you know, we lived on a boat, and I remember there was no electricity or running water or anything for a while. So we were sort of a bit on the fringes of things, really, you know, a bit punky. I had all sorts of peculiar hair and that kind of thing going on. And then, see, Acid House started, and that was the start of something different. I noticed like this kind of paradigm shift in what was going on in music then, because the rave scene brought elements of the punk scene into it, because it was a kind of a fringe activity, and there was, you know, there was parties involved, and there was kind of an anti-establishment element to it, which we were, you know, which we were kind of a part of. And the fact that they came down so heavily on the party scene drew a lot of people who were of our kind of persuasion into that scene. It wasn't for everybody. A lot of people just, you know, weren't into that kind of dance thing, you know, the funk element of it. But I really loved the way that it had this kind of raw thing going, which was the punky thing, but also it had some funk to it. And that, it was like, before that happened, the two scenes were like at opposite ends of the pole, really. You had, you know, the disco type, funky dance room type, Sinatra's club music, and you had punk rock, which was, you know, rock and roll, which was kind of diametrically opposed to that. And this seemed to fuse the best elements of those two to me. And so I was like absolutely smitten with it, you know. First couple of parties that I went to, I knew some guys who lived out in Hampshire, and I remember them taking me to parties out by Stockbridge. The hippie convoy used to go up to Stonehenge and set up, and they'd have, you know, their brightly coloured horse boxes that they lived in. They'd have a sound system, and they'd set up and have a party, and you'd go out and party with them, and it completely changed direction for me. The other point being that I was, by this time I was already, you know, I was kind of in my late 20s, early 30s, and I had access to some equipment, because one of the guy who produced The Men They Couldn't Hang, Pat Collier, who's still a good friend and a very, you know, he's a very important producer in the UK. He did the Wonder Staff and Jesus and Mary Chain. Don't know if you remember these people.
Yes, I remember Jesus and Mary Chain. It rings a bell anyway. I've been a dance music head. That was kind of the thing that turned me on. God, I don't know. I was probably 9, 10, 11 maybe, because
Right.
my brother is 11 years older than me, so he was going to all of the first raves. He was sort of, that was his thing, and bringing back like cassette tapes, and I would get glimpses of it. And music hadn't really been a thing for me until I heard the first one of those. So, you know, the radio was always on in the house, but nothing really lit me up until that first tape. And I remember even at a young age, I remember the first one he had, mad thing called Learn More About the Nature of Energy by a group called Random Molecular Motion. And it was this mad, like real old rave kind of music, really very, very raw, like you said, as unpolished as you could want, but it just lit me up, and that was it. So I've been almost in that tunnel vision of dance music ever since. It's always been the sound that has lit me up more than anything else. I like some bands and things, don't get me wrong. I don't totally alienate other music, but it's just the thing that gets me every single time. So I've heard of some of the acts that you're talking about, but I have never sort of immersed myself in that, that's for sure.
Right. See, it's really interesting you should say that, because I remember those tapes. I mean, I've got one sitting over there, Manic Mix, you know, which I think I picked up in 91 or something, 1991. And it was such a rare and precious thing at that time, wasn't it? There were no dance compilations as such, you know. No, nothing you could get like that on CD. Radio 1 wouldn't play the music because it was associated with, you know, acid house and illegal parties, and they didn't like the vibe anyway on the radio, on national radio then. It went completely against their agenda, which was like, you know, they were playing a lot of indie guitar music, which was, you know, what they would play in the evening, and pop music in the day, and the idea of acid house. And I still think they're a bit, you know, I still think national radio is still a bit funny about that music, really. It's something they never quite got over. Pete Tong had a lot to do with this music gaining acceptance on national broadcast networks. But my point being that it's interesting that you at that age still got that vibe from somebody bringing a cassette, because I was thinking, you know, I was going out, you know, and partying and all the rest of it, and it was a big change, big thing, and I had that same feeling as you're describing about getting that cassette and putting it on, and it had this slightly kind of, you know, it's been recorded directly off decks, and, you know, it wasn't fabulous quality or anything, but somehow that all added to it, you know, the mystique of it. It just felt like like the Hendrix thing that I was saying earlier. It felt like something exotic, you know.
Well, it's really interesting because when you were describing the Hendrix thing, and particularly your brother's band, for me, that was my brother's mate who lived literally just around the corner, a 2-minute walk, getting a set of Technics 1210s, because they got bitten by the bug of this music straight away, just like you when it came out. And so one of them, like, you know, in the corner of his bedroom, he's got the deck set up and all of this stuff, and his mum's complaining all the time. And I used to go there, and I used to sit and watch them, you know, in awe of my bigger brother and his older friends, you know, like you are, as the younger brother watching this.
Yeah.
And the thing that I was fascinated with, rather than the bass guitar, were these turntables. And I mean, for me, they're still magical things, incredible pieces of kit, totally solid, just beautiful in design. I love everything there is to love about a Technics 1210. And that was my thing, just sitting watching them, like, doing that and what they are up to, and this new music and all of those things. And that, for me, that I guess was also a part of the magic. But all it took was that one cassette tape, and I was, you know, that's been me for life.
But what's interesting is that magic that you're talking about and that feeling that you're describing, I mean, where does that come from? You know, why do you pick up on that? And certain people just do for some reason. I'm sure that's a completely other podcast, but for some reason, you do sense that there's a kind of a magic about it. I mean, I'm sure it's nothing very mysterious, but it just communicates its magicness to you. You know, somehow you're fascinated with it and very drawn to it. And also, it's interesting what you say about the technology, the fact that there is a piece of kit involved, which, you know, you have to use in order to get that magic happening. That in itself is a magic thing somehow when you're young, and you kind of, it lights you up, doesn't it? That's
totally. I mean, well, I know, without jumping too far ahead, because we'll sort of circle back round and carry on with your journey, but the other thing as well is just the atmosphere of it all. So I went to my first rave myself when I was 14, because I could not wait to get out. And you and I have talked about this in the past. It's the magical Hastings Pier. So that was the first ever place that I managed to, like, sneak in under the radar. I don't think they really gave too much of a monkeys, to be fair. And we all went in with our fake IDs and all the rest of it. But even that environment and the feeling that something was going on and it was different and it just wasn't mainstream, and bar a very small handful of my mates, everybody else was going into what I'd call the Sharon and Tracy nightclubs and chasing the girls and all of that stuff. And I'd instead stepped into this other world that felt incredibly different. Yes. Talking to anybody and everybody, and there was an atmosphere about that I just wasn't picking up in my taste of any of the other environments that I went to listen to music.
Yeah. Well, which parties do you remember? The first one that you went to, actually?
Oh,
do you remember who played?
The first ones, I seem to remember it was a guy called DJ Ramos. So it was a proper old rave guy.
that not Man Machine? Is that him? No. Anyway,
I don't think so.
let's
I've
not
got a
digress.
feeling there might have been Slipmat as well. Who's obviously is is a name that most people will be familiar with. I'm pretty sure that he was playing that night as well. So yeah, the first night. I think it might have been called Fusion, but I don't know for sure because there were a lot of different nights that I went to on Hastings Pier. But I think that's going to cycle us in really nicely to one specific night as well that was going on local to me, which was called Babylicious. And that was put on by a certain gentleman that is the next step in your story, I think.
Yes. Well, that was about that time that I met John. What I was saying to you was that the guy Pat, who produced The Men They Couldn't Hang, who also produced People Like Wonder Stuff, and also he produced some stuff by Primal Scream. So you can see there's a kind of connection there. He'd had a big hit with Wonder Stuff, and he had made enough money to open his own studio up in Old Street. And he put it on, he bought one of those old kind of warehouse type buildings and had a studio on the top floor, a studio on the bottom floor, and in the middle he had a couple of floors with not very much in. And he went out and bought half a dozen Akai S1000 samplers because he could see that that was, I mean, there were stereo samplers, the Akai S1000, and it was a step forward in the technology. Now, you'll remember that the Akai S1000 and the Atari is really what UK dance music was written on at around that time. And I remember another engineer telling me, I was playing keyboards in a session somewhere, and he said, Nick, you're a keyboard player. Why don't you go and, get yourself an Atari and a Roland D110, because they play 8 parts at the same time. And I was thinking, what? They play 8 parts. It's a multi-timbral synthesizer, Roland, one of the first ones. And so I went and bought this kit, an Atari with Cracker Cubase on. Would never do anything like that now, I hasten to add. But I think that's what a lot of people did. And rumor had it that Cubase were putting out cracks at the time to get people interested in what the technology was able to do. And I remember hooking this up and, doing 8-10 tracks of sequence stuff live, didn't need a tape recorder. Again, one of those moments, magic, and as soon as I did it, I was like, right, that's me. That is the ability to be able to arrange, do the arrangement yourself, do the hats, the snare, the kick, the bass, the keyboard, whatever else. The ability to be able to stack that up and make an arrangement was, I had no idea that this technology was available. That was around about 89, something like that. I thought, right, this, that just suited what I could do down to the ground. And the thing about Pat was, I was making an album with him and he had all these Akai S1000s. He said, why don't you come down to the studio and, familiarize yourself with this technology and see what you can do with it? Because he could tell I was keen. So he gave me a bit of space and a sampler and an Atari and said, well, see what you can make out of this. Because he didn't know where it was going to go. I didn't know where it was going to go, but we knew it was going to go somewhere. So I started that and fried my brains for about 3 months trying to figure out what was going on with the sampler. But, I'd been given an opportunity, so I grabbed it with both hands and I spent every hour I could in that room trying to figure out how to make that kit work. And I got, good at using the S1000. Tricky little number, it's one of those, it's like programming through a letterbox. That's what they always used to say. But once you, got your head around what you could do and the way that you could loop out samples and, treat samples and stack them up, and then S1000 with an Atari was absolutely brilliant little system. And a lot of those, people that I knew, Nick Warren, he had, 3 or 4 of them, him and Jody doing early stuff together. That was the system. So I had that room in the greenhouse that was owned by Pat, and that's where I met John. Because I was still doing sessions and still playing in bands. And one of the guys in one of the bands, Simeon, who's a saxophone player friend of mine, he knew John. And he said to John, because they were, kind of drinking buddies, and he said, why don't you go and have a word with Nick, my mate, because he's doing this, making these type of records and trying to make these type of records, and maybe you could do something together. So I'm eternally grateful to Simeon for making that introduction. I mean, you meet people when you've got a room and you've got an Atari and a sampler and a bit of kit, but you don't expect them to turn out to be John. You know what I mean? And yeah. I had no idea. It was just one of those things. He happened to be serious about what he was doing, and I was serious about what I was doing. And so, we built it up from there. We started working from there. I mean, early attempts were pretty rough. There's still a couple of remixes floating around from 1991 that I prefer not to think about. But again, you have to take these things in context, and you listen to a lot of records from around those times and they sound rough and ready, and I guess that's what part of the charm was, really.
Well, everyone's got to start somewhere, haven't they? That's the thing with this. It's to expect to walk into it and be just making the best pieces of music from the get-go is completely unrealistic if you're not making a few mistakes and a few things that you don't like, so you can learn what you do like.
Well, and also
never going to play out.
Also, it was how it was at that point. Records sound. Some of the early acid house records, they just sound very kind of basic, really. And I do remember the initial attempts at acid house. I wasn't particularly interested in because they did sound so basic. But of course, the missing link with that music was the fact that you played it through a thumping great sound system. And, you had an audience of people who were, in various states of intoxication, I mean, it's acid house music. That's how it got its name. So if you played those rough and ready raw records, but did it through a sound system to a bunch of people who were in the right sort of mood to, accept and appreciate it, it became something else. And at the very, early 87, 88 type acid house, I hadn't quite got because I hadn't been out to hear it in the proper context, you see. So totally. That's the missing link for that music. That right, I'll put this to you, that's where the idea that some of this music is underground comes from. One of the reasons being that it operates on two levels. You listen to it on the radio, in your car, on your hi-fi system, excuse the dated phrase, and the hi-fi, on the gramophone.
Yeah, exactly.
The radiogram.
That brings back some classic memories as well, the hi-fi.
You play acid house on the radiogram. Doesn't have quite the same effect as it does when you listen to it at a rave in a warehouse through a big sound system. So it's operating on that level. You go out and you think, oh, okay, right, now this sounds different. So there's an underground element to it because you can only really experience it as it's supposed to be experienced if you go out to a party, you see. I mean,
yeah, totally.
Things have changed slightly now, but my feeling is, and that's what we've brought forward all these years, the underground idea being that you have to be there in order to appreciate it. You have to be there underground in a basement with a sodding great sound system having it.
Totally. Now this links in really well, actually, because one of the things that really resonated with everybody when we were doing the online workshop was this type of ethos that you're talking about now. When you're actually in the studio and you're making a record, this is something that's in your head, is the experience that the people on the dance floor are going to have to the piece of music that you're writing. So it's not just in the studio, it's almost like you're kind of jumping out into the environment to think, how's that going to work? And I mean, I don't want to sort of take all the words out your mouth because I'd love to hear you explaining it, but there was just specific things where you were talking about parts of the breakdown and wanting to take them somewhere else in their head for this to happen and all of these things. So if you can just speak to, you know, how you think about a record and the environment that it's going to end up in whilst you're creating it, please.
Yeah, well, I don't know about you, but I remember distinctly in the 90s, especially when we were kind of, you know, still learning and developing the music. There was no substitute, absolutely no substitute for going out, right? And it's what we were doing anyway. I was single, I was involved in the music business, I was trying to write the music, so went to a load of parties. And that's what people were doing, you know, 93, 94, 95 anyway. There was, you know, people my age, we were all going out and we were all having a great time, appreciating the music. And it was still pretty new. Now, the thing is, you come back from a night out like that of just, you know, absorbing music for 7-8 hours. The feeling of the music, I mean, it's in you, you know, it's not just in your head, you know, it's kind of your whole being kind of has this sort of memory of what you've just been through. And you're thinking, right, okay, it's like hitting a reset button rather than getting into your head and thinking, well, I better make that transition proper and I better make these hi-hats a little bit different. I better make that, I better do this, I better play this melody, I better do that melody, I better change that sound. It kind of going out and listening to a DJ mix in a club would shift your attention from all those details into the feeling that you had and it gave you and what it was supposed to be making you feeling, see? And so I used to come back, and for the 2 or 3 days after I'd been out, I was able to, you know, make headway in writing that sort of music because I still had, you know, the feeling in my being of what I was, you know, how it was supposed to go, how it was supposed to sound. So, you know, it would be more like you'd be stripping out some of the details. You'd be, and you'd still have in your mind the picture in your head of the sound system, you know, the image of the sound system, and what was coming out of the speakers is almost had like a personality, really. That's how it felt to me. And so you would set about trying to imbue your music with the personality of that evening. And as you rightly say, having that mental image in your mind of that party and what was happening in that party was a huge help, because then instead of just sitting there in front of your sequencer and, you know, small set of speakers, they became the club PA system. And you were able to kind of, by using that image in your head, you were able to bridge that divide between your room and being out. You know, that was a really useful thing to be able to do. And then, of course, you know, you gradually, the memory and the feeling of the night would kind of ebb away over the days. But by then, you had a little bit of an idea that you could work with. And then what happened, you know, how I used to work was I'd get the inspiration from the night and then get something going. And then you'd get to the point where you'd be finessing it a bit more, you know, making it so that it did work as an arrangement and so that it did work in terms of the way that the energy was moving through the track. But having the image of the night and I don't know, for some, I've always been fascinated with sound systems as well and speaker systems. I used to, when I was on tour, I used to spend a lot of time with the crew, really, rather than the band, because I was interested in, you know, just liked it, you know, like you're saying, I just was interested in what sound systems did, what they looked like, you know, racks of amps, that kind of thing, what they were for, trying to sort of make the connection in my mind between what we were doing, what the sound system was doing, and what the people were getting out of it. And I found it fantastically useful to have that kind of, as I say, image of what was happening in the night. I mean, I remember going Ministry first few times and seeing with that big Martin system, you know, the boxes in Ministry, and clever what they did there. It's Martin Audio, but the way that they made the sound system a kind of feature of it, you know, they weren't trying to hide it away. They were like, right, sodding great big speaker stacks, 4 in the room, very visible, people up there dancing on the speakers, you know, great big woody pieces of kit, which made this awesome sound. And almost like, you know, taking that and using what that was to feature in your music. So it was, you know, you were writing music for systems. That's what we were doing, really. And of course, John was DJing, always DJ'd ever since he was like 15, passionate about it. So he was standing there from day one with these records, road testing them, you see. And he would be like, okay, that was all right, but there's too much going on. It's been a story of reducing over the years. I mean, in the 90s, he and Sasha were known for this kind of epic sound, and we've been kind of paring it back ever since, you know.
So, and this is a really fascinating thing that certainly, you know, I'm sure everybody's interested in here, is how do you guys work together? I mean, it's, for example, now on a tune, or obviously you've just done the album Quattro, but then you've got the remix that I talked about, the Corsa remix. On any of these pieces of music, how do you two get together? Because you've been working together for years and years and years now. So what is the actual production process? What does that look like?
Right, well, look, it's evolved, right? But I'll give you a quick rundown. First few attempts in 91, you know, 92, what would happen, and this is still good practice, he would turn up, you know, and he would have a bunch of records, you know, a bunch of vinyl. Everybody's playing vinyl in those days. And we'd be like, right, well, where do we start? And so he would say, well, I like this sound on this record. And so I think, okay, that's kind of doable. And then he'd say, oh, no, I like this sound on this record. I'd say, all right. And then he would say, the percussion on this, I think sounds fantastic. So basically, I would try and build tracks using these kind of elements. And I think this is sort of standard practice really in how music has been made in the recorded medium over the years. I mean, famously, Motown, Tamla Motown, the soul label, was people trying to recreate the rhythm and blues they heard on Atlantic records and getting it a bit wrong. That's how the Motown sound came about. And what our sound was, you know, records that John loved. I remember he used to really rate David Morales, Derek Carter, people like that, the Chicago house scene. John was, you know, really early onto that and playing those types of records and hunting those records down and, you know, going over to the States and finding stuff, and always hungry for vinyl. You know, he was like one of those guys, he was in the record shop all the time and, you know, paying money, and because he knew that people in this country didn't know that music. So I was the beneficiary of that as a producer, because he would come in to the studio with those records and he'd be saying, right, well, you know, this sounds good, doesn't it? And I'd be going, well, yeah, you know, I'd never heard it before. I didn't know what the hell it was. And so, you know, like some Chicago house records and the way that the programmed hi-hats would come in and cowbells, that kind of thing, that percussion, very mechanistic sounding, as I'm saying. You know, they're made from drum machines, which are recorded down. But, John loved all that. So he'd say, right, let's try a bit of this. And so I'd try recreating it with some of the drum machines that I had. And he'd also, but, we ended up using samples. And then we'd, cheekily sample a bit off. If there was an exposed loop or something, we'd, nick it and stick it on the record. That's what everybody was doing. I'm not going to go into details in case we get lawsuits. But so that's how we started off. John would bring in stuff and we'd listen through together and try and build tracks from elements that he would introduce to me. And I had kind of musical facility in terms of playing keyboard lines. And so he'd say, well, why don't we try a line like this? And so I'd listen to the line and then try something which was similar, but not the same, with a different sound. And I'd say to John, well, what about this line? And he'd say, okay, that's a good line, but I don't like the sound. So I'd say, right, okay, sit him down in front of one of the synthesizers and then say, right, well, find a sound that you want. And I remember he would like start off at preset number 1 and go through to preset number 127 and then turn around and look at me as if to say, what happens now? I go, well, you choose one. That's what we do. All right. Well, I don't like any of those.
Oh, I know that feeling only too well, that I'm sure you do, going through like a ream of sounds and going, oh no, none of those sounds are what I was really looking for.
Except for the fact that, my idea about it is we'll just pick one. It doesn't really matter. It's a running joke with me and John. I'd be like saying, well, look, a string sound is a string sound. Just pick one and use it, And he'd be like, no, you can't do that, And I'm going, oh, for God's sake, it doesn't matter, it doesn't matter. That's not what's important. It's what it's doing. It's what the record's doing. People don't buy records on the basis of what the hi-hat sounds like, That's not what they like about it. What they like about it is the atmosphere. And he was like, yeah, well, maybe, I suppose, I don't know. He was never convinced by that argument, John, never convinced. But that's how we started making records. And then to get the thing to sound halfway decent in those days, it needed a proper mix down, really. I mean, the technology now is, since everything migrated into the computer and it became, the computers gained the power that they have now you can make decent sounding records in the box, and lots of people do. I mean, you don't have to do it that way, and it's a contentious issue. But those days, you couldn't do that, really. If you wanted to make a record which was releasable by, a reputable label, you had to take it into a decent studio, mix it properly by somebody who knew how to mix, And we were lucky enough to be in the greenhouse, Pat's place, which did have a couple of rooms with big, nice big desks and people who knew how to drive them properly, and bunches of compressors and things. And so we were lucky there as well, because I did have the facility available to me to get the thing out. I mean, what we would do was take I had two Akai samplers, which had 10 outputs each. And so you'd split everything up, and so you had 20 outs, and then whatever other synths you were using, and just put it all up a big desk. We had various Desh SSLs. Neve was in there at one point, and mix it down to the required standard. So that's what we'd do. John would come in with the inspiration and the direction. And that's the thing with John. Always knew what he wanted from the music, which is, in my experience, that's rare, that somebody would have that kind of vision from that early on. I mean, really, he's still promoting the same vision that he has of that music. As a sideman, which I was at the time, I liked a bit of hardcore. I liked a bit of house music. I liked some breakbeat. Well, before it was breakbeat, I liked some regular kind of, more trancey stuff. I didn't realize this was kind of before genres, really. It was like acid house, and then there was stuff which wasn't quite acid house. and that was about it. Then you got hardcore. This was before drum and bass. I remember drum and bass coming in and thinking, what is that? You know, never really been a drum and bass fan myself. But you know, it's a perfectly valid thing, and there's been some amazing music made in that genre. That's not what we do. There was, but John, my point being that John always knew what he wanted it to sound like, and that's what became the Bedrock sound. So if I head off too far in a particular direction, he would bring me back from that and say, no, that's, you know, there would be some elements or a way of doing things. Some of it he just lived with and he was fine with. Some of it he loved, and some of it was like, no, that's not what we're doing, you know.
Yeah, totally. So how many sort of iterations does a track tend to go through? So obviously when you cracked open the remix and we had a look at that, I know you'd had sort of various versions because you jumped back to a few different iterations of the remix that you've been working on. How many sort of ideas do you tend to go through before you hit something where you go, yeah, now I feel like this has captured the feel that I want, and then you start to get to the business of the full arrange, you know, as you said, I think the proper arrangement and the mix down and all of those things.
Yeah. It always feels like a bit of a mountain when we start, really, and I get that same kind of feeling because you've got nothing in front of you. I mean, remixing is different because you do have some basic elements, but nonetheless, you know, the feeling is, I've got this mountain to climb, right, better start. And what happens when you start climbing that mountain is you do a bit of work and then you look up and you think, Jesus, I am nowhere near, you know. And the early stages of it are hard because you're dealing with something which hasn't had a lot of work done on it, and you don't like it very much because of that, right? And the thing is, you have to get through that part of the process. You have to take it as read that if you keep working at it, chipping away at it, eventually, and this is what I find happens, eventually you'll get one or two elements where you think, oh, I actually quite like that. That's what I'm looking for first, right? Is if I can get somewhere where it's not just all sounding like horrendous crap, if I can get something which just has something about it that makes me think, right there, that is something that I like, I can build on that. You have to get that's base camp, right? Now once you've got something which is, oh right, I can work with this, that's when you go on to the next stage, right? What I used to notice, what I felt was happening, was that ideas seemed to me to have a gestation period, right? Which is like, you know, I'm sorry, you just have to go through this. You have to try this 3 or 4 ideas before you're going to find one which does something for you, right? Always seem to be about that many ideas, 3 or 4. You'll try 3 or 4, and then maybe 5, and you'll come up with something that has something about it that you feel as if means something to you, resonates with you. And you just have to sit there, and you can't just sit there and do nothing. You have to try things, you know. You have to try, right, okay, let's match that rhythm with this bass line. Okay, let's match that loop with this kick drum. Okay, let's match this melody. And then in the course of trying those few ideas, a couple of them will decide that they like each other, right? Then that means that gives you the initial impetus to start writing, because you found something that, you know, that you think is good, right? So you have to get to that stage. Now, to answer your question more directly, how many versions do we end up with? What happens is that I'll get to the point where I've got a very basic idea, which would be like a groove, melody, some kind of treatment, which I think is okay. And what I'll do is I'll bounce out maybe a minute of that and then send it to John and say, what do you think of this? Before I go too far down the road. And, I present him with, an all singing, all dancing finished remix. And he goes, that's not it. Rather than do that, I'll bounce out a minute or so of it. I mean, these days, I kind of know what it is that's needed. So more often than not, he'll just say, sounds great, carry on. So if he gives me the green light of the first initial, idea, demo, whatever you want to call it, then I'll work that up. And I'll send him like a completed version, but not finished, a version which runs from A to B. And he'll give me notes then about that. You say, there'll be invariably there's a couple of things which have just definitely said, no, that I don't like that there, and I don't like that there. Okay, and then he'll make a couple of other suggestions. Why don't you make the bass more throbby or something like that, less of a line, just make it more of a sound effect, that kind of thing, right? So then we get to version 2, which is no, that would be version 3, because version 2 is the completed version. Version 3 will be the version that I've made acting on his notes, right? And then there'll be another 3 versions where we're just finessing it then. So, and invariably it tends to be less than 10 versions, but it's normally around 7 or 8 completed versions before it's a finished version. But I mean, the thing is that's work in progress. That's what work in progress is. It's like just getting closer and closer to the point at which you can say, okay, now that's finished. And conversely, the bit right at the beginning of the writing process, remixing process, where I feel as if I'm on top of the mountain and you've got a lot of work to do just to make it up the first bit. Then when you're on version 7 or 8, that's the enjoyable side of it, because you've got something which is feeling, nice and bright, chunky, has momentum, touches in it. And what you're doing then is you're just adding the icing on the cake. That's the enjoyable part of the process, because you know that you've got a track which is halfway decent in there, and unless you do something really drastic, all you're doing is just making it, tweaking it so that it's even better than it was. That's what we're aiming for, and that's the part of the process that's the most enjoyable. I mean, you know what I mean, don't you?
Yeah, awesome. I'm curious, is it a case of at what point in those iterations does John play the track? Does he only play it when it's at the end, or is there a point where he says, right, let me road test this before I come back to you with any final notes?
Yeah, no, good point. He will road test it. I mean, thing about John, one of his huge advantages, not what's the word? Anyway, one of his things is that he has, as a DJ, he's got a lot of nerve, right? He's got balls, and he's confident about what he plays, the choices that he makes. I mean, you wouldn't necessarily think so to meet him as a person, because he's quite self-effacing and he's quiet, he's not big, loud, he's not in your face type of guy at all. But he's very astute, and also he's very confident about his own judgment and his ability to take a piece of music which is not probably the best piece of music or the most life-changing piece of music you've ever heard, weave it into a mix in such a way that it makes sense. I mean, this is one of his things, man. It's a really clever thing that he's done. He's made a career out of taking music which isn't necessarily groundbreaking, earth-shattering, the most all singing, all dancing piece of music you ever heard. But he'll take pieces of music which are, more unassuming than that, and make them into mixes which tell a story and make sense. It's been, it's been an incredibly clever way of developing a sound, that has, because he's taken things which, like I say, which other people might not necessarily look twice at, and made use of them in such a way that makes perfect sense of them. So the answer to your question is that he has got the ability and the balls to take a mix which is halfway finished, stick it into a set such as you wouldn't notice that it's not finished. But he is able at that point to say, okay, that was pretty good, but it's too long, or it needs that bit taken out, or the kick sounds too reverby, those kind of things. Yeah, because the music makes sense to him. You see, he's not a classically trained musician, doesn't really know any music theory at all, but he's got the ear. His brain makes sense of music, right? So when you discuss things with him about the music that you're making, it's not just random nonsense that he says to me. It's things which mean something, and he can say something about the music that he's making, and I can understand what it is and do something about it because he's made sense of it. You see what I mean?
Totally.
It's not, so he'll pick up version 4, play that out, and then we'll go on to version 6 or 7. See? So
yeah, it makes total sense. So are there any other sort of areas that are kind of challenges and things that you have to deal with as a professional? So there obviously, as life as a creative comes with a number of things, periods of creative block, or maybe you send stuff to John that he doesn't like, or maybe there are other things that you find a kind of a struggle, but that you bite down on the gum shield and you just keep pushing forward, because I mean that's what you do. You're a professional at the end of the day, and you keep knocking out the tracks and you hit the deadlines and you do all of those things. So I guess my curiosity is some challenges and the way that you deal with them, because everybody faces challenges, and I'm sure some people will overlap with some of the things that that you find to be more difficult than others.
That's interesting question. I don't get much in the way of block, really, simply because there's a few things. For instance, John, one thing that he's always said is, when you're making a piece of dance music, it doesn't need to be all singing, all dancing. It doesn't need to be earth-shattering. It doesn't need to be your finest piece of work ever. It just needs to be right. It needs to be playable, and so don't get too hung up on the details or whether or not you're fulfilling your creative potential. We all have those issues, but what's more important is to come up with something that stands on its own, something that goes from A to B, something that has a groove or a rhythm to it. I'm talking specifically about dance music. Something that has a groove or a rhythm that will just keep the party going. The thing is, if you're not feeling at your most creative that day, then don't write your most creative piece of music. But make sure that you do cover some ground with it. I mean, we can, John will play a piece of music which starts as a groove, goes all the way through and finishes as that groove. It'd be like, and he used to get a lot of those tracks. He said, well, this is the idea, and it's a groove and a bass line, and that's it, but it doesn't mean to say that he's not going to play it, because that person might have got the bottom line right of this piece of music, which is that it moves and it makes you want to move, and it goes from A to B, and it does a bit of something in the middle, and then it finishes. So the thing is, if I'm feeling not at my most creative, or I don't have that, a lot of it is luck, I think. Sometimes you happen to pick the right kick drum sample, you happen to use the right bass drum sound, you happen to pick a bunch of elements which just really, really work together, and one track will pop its head up, But the thing is, unless you're prepared to do those few tracks then you're not going to necessarily come across the one which has a little bit more to it. So you take the fact that you're writing stuff which isn't quite as brilliant as some of the other stuff as part of the process. And the other thing about that is you do not know what another person is going to get out of a piece of music. You know what I mean? You do not have the right to say what somebody else is enjoying about the piece of music that you've written. You know, you can think yourself what it is that you like about that piece of music, but the number of times that people have come up to me and said what they like about a remix that I've done that A, I haven't even noticed about it, or B, might have been a mistake anyway, you know? So, and they'll go, well, I really like that track because it's got the way that the clap changes halfway through. And I'm thinking to myself, well, I didn't do that on purpose. I didn't even notice it, you know? So what I'm saying is, just because you happen to be not seeing something in a piece of music, somebody else might see something in a piece of music that you haven't even noticed. You see? I mean, the question of ownership of a piece of music is a contentious one, you know, but I'm feeling that, you know, I'm here and I'm trying to channel whatever it is, you know, my feelings about doing a piece of music. I'm trying to channel it into the work that I do. But once you've done it, you've finished, it's boxed off and it's done and it's out there, then, you know, it's for everybody, isn't it? It's not, you know, it's not, that's the difference between doing this in a serious way and doing it for your own pleasure, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to, you know, come up with something that sprouts its own legs and means something to somebody else. You know, that's what I want from a piece of music. I want it to mean something to somebody. You know, it has to mean something to me in order to do it in the first place. But once I've done that, then, you know, it's like you're giving it over. You're allowing it to, you know, do its thing for other people, you know, and you haven't got much control over that. So what I'm saying is don't agonize too much over that stuff. Just do the work. Yeah.
Yeah, I absolutely love it. I mean, I had to scribble down the line. You don't have the right to say what somebody else enjoys about the piece of music you've written. I think that is absolutely gold.
Makes sense.
Yeah, oh, it does though. Totally. I mean, I always talk to people about the idea of, you know, your job as a creative is to ship. It is to get stuff out for people to hear. So you, of course, want to enjoy it yourself, but then you put this out into the world, and the piece of music doesn't define you. It's its own thing now that's come through you, and you've finished. It goes, and it's not personal. It's not about you. If they don't like or do like something about it, it's not them saying they do or don't like something about you. They're now talking about the piece of work, and that's it. It's gone out there. But it is very interesting just the way you structured it, as in, actually, it's a bit more than that. Who are you to say to somebody else what their opinion is on something that you've created?
You cannot experience something on behalf of somebody else. You can't do it. That's not how it works.
Totally.
That belongs to them, you know. Who knows how it works, but you can't have somebody else's experience.
Yeah, totally. That is super, super powerful. And it's interesting because my last question for you is advice for up and coming producers. I'm still going to put it to you, but I think you're going to have to do some hell of a job now, Nick, to beat that last thing that you said, because I think that was so powerful and so on point.
Cool.
But if you were to have any advice for people who are now they're into the music, that maybe they've even been making it for a while, but it's their passion, and they want to go places, they want to get it out into the world, a lesson that maybe you've learned, something that you'd like to pass on?
Well, look, doing this stuff and, you know, trying to make a living at music is the devil's own job. I'm no businessman. John is a businessman, and, you know, he's done well out of it, but he's good at that stuff, you know, as well as being a great DJ. I mean, the DJ, it's interesting what happens, because DJs, they're like, it's the ultimate expression of what the 80s became, was they are middlemen as artists, aren't they? And John kind of, you know, fits the bill in terms of making that work as a DJ and also as a businessman. You know, he's just very good at it, and a shining example to anybody who wants to build a career. If it's the music you're talking about, then it's a vocation, and I'm sorry, man, there's no easy way. You have to commit. You know, you really have to commit, and there's plenty of people out there who are as keen and keener than you are. So you're competing with them. If you want to stand out, then you know you have to go into it. I always remember I can remember I made a track early in my career called Mandala under the name Monumental, and it was the first time somebody had offered me an EP. They said, "Okay, well, why don't you make an EP?" And I thought, "Oh, great idea." And so I was sitting there making it and realized at that point that I had to make it sound proper, you know, and that involved about 10 times more work than I initially thought it would, because you've got to go in there and you've got to make all those things that you would kind of let pass, just make them right. You know what I mean? My tendency was to sit there with the piece, run it through and thinking, oh, well, that's not quite how I want it, but I'll just leave it. Don't do that. Make it right. Make it as right as you can. And the thing is, as in the course of making those things right, then you do that a few times and you start to end up with a track which, you know, sounds a bit better than, you know, the normal run of things. So do that extra bit, go that extra mile, spend an extra couple of hours. I mean, I'm lucky, Keith, because I've got a high boredom threshold, right? And I can sit here for long periods of time pissing about with hi-hats, you know. I remember Pat telling me, he said, Nick, I don't know how many other people I know could sit in a room for 4 years and listen to hi-hats, you know. And it never even occurred to me, but it isn't a problem for me because you know, it's not the same with anybody. John gets a bit fractious in the studio sometimes. I was talking to Luke Brancaccio yesterday, and he was saying he has to do 1.5 hour spurts. They go off and do something else, and then come back to it. I mean, he yields great results. He's making some great records. He's just made a brilliant record called sorry, mate, I See Colour, which he told me today is just signed to Crosstown Rebels, which is the first track, well, second track actually on the Transmissions mix I've just done. Anyway, he was saying he has to do 1.5 hours, go and do something else and then come back to it. I don't have to do that. I can sit there for a long time. But my point about it was, it does need that focus. It does need that commitment, you know. And you want to take the veil away from the speakers. You want to take the curtain back, push the curtain back and get that sound coming out at you. That takes a bit of work, takes a bit of attention to detail. So just go the extra mile, push it as far as you can, and see what it is that happens, because you will get results if you're prepared to do that. You know, if you're prepared to, you know, do that little bit extra and not let those details that you know aren't quite right, not let them go. Just tweak them, bring them out, get rid of them if they're not right, make it right. Yeah. Makes sense?
Makes total sense. Brilliant stuff. Thank you very much. Just quickly before we say a proper goodbye, what do you got coming up? What can the people expect? So I know we've got Quattro out. I know that we've got the imminent release of your remix of Corsa on Bedrock with John. What else? So yeah, when the good people are listening to this, that will already be available to grab. And if you haven't heard it yet, you want to, because I tell you now, when Nick opened up Logic and played this for us and showed us inside of it to a person, everybody, whether it's their style of music or not, because we've got the guys through the techno and the deeper house and the proggy kind of guys and the tech house guys, everybody who was on that session to a person was just like, holy cow, this is a seriously good piece of dance music. So for anyone who hasn't heard that, you definitely want to check that out. What else is coming up, Nick?
Well, one other thing is I've got a tune called Remind Me Later, which is coming out on an Argentinian label called Omnia. Omnia are guys who've taken me out to Argentina for some parties, and they've been really helpful. And they're starting a label, and this is the first track on their label. Like I said, it's called Remind Me Later. It's out in June. There's a remix by Mariano Molino and Bonder, right? Baunder. And Mariano, he's a friend, but they make great records, man. I mean, it's progressive. It does a lot on Sudbeat, which is Hernan Catania's label. But they've done a remix, and I'm really grateful to them for doing it. And also Luce, who runs Omnia. So that's out in June. I'm doing a mix. I'll have to do that later today or tomorrow for Paul Sawyer, who runs Crafted. You know him?
Mm-hmm.
Crafted Underground and Crafted Records. He's a good guy. And I'm doing a mix which will be out next week. There's some kind of interview with me in Zone magazine, which he sorted out. That's coming up. I just had John on the phone, so I don't know what he's thinking.
We'll craftily edit out of the middle of this podcast as well.
Okay. I mean, if John rings, if I don't answer the call, then I get heaps of shit, you know. So I get the piss taken out of me. So I thought I'd just say hi. So there's stuff happening. I've got I'm talking to Proton about maybe putting out a record with them. It's as much as I can write, really. If I can write stuff, then you know we can develop it. It's just getting the time to come up with the material. Like I say, I'm always looking for the time to sit down and make the next tune. You would have thought I'd got tired of it by now, wouldn't you? But
well, no.
I'm still trying to find a fucking kick drum, man.
When we listen to your passion, it's obvious why you haven't. And I'll just say as well, in case you forgot, that every single week you're currently doing a DJ live stream as well on your Facebook
Super
page
Tuesdays,
as well.
9:30
Tuesdays. There we go. So you can get a regular fix of quality tunes from Nick every single week at the moment as well.
Hopefully, yeah.
Buddy, it's been amazing having you on the show. Thank you for sharing all of these sort of nuggets of wisdom and your journey and how you work. There's like so much stuff that people are going to be really locked into, because it's always fascinating to know who the person is behind the records, but to then understand the ethos and the ideas and the journey and how it all comes about and how that arrives in the studio, and then the work that you put in to make it translate onto the dance floor. I think that's, used this word before, magical, but it really is very, it really captures your imagination. It's very inspiring to hear that. And I think that now for people, when they listen to one of your records and they've got that backstory, I think it makes it all the more special.
Oh, wicked. Yeah, hope so. Bring it to life a bit. That's the idea, eh?
Yeah, totally. Thank you very much, sir, for coming on.
No problem, Keith. Thanks for having me, and I'll speak to you very soon, eh?